This video is brought to you by Ground News. Seeing photos and videos of politicians watching and attempting to talk about football is usually cringe-inducing. They're often caught in a weird middle ground of trying to look authentic while also trying to remain professional. Despite this though, that's not to say that all politicians are faking their enthusiasm for the sport. Keir Starmer is a committed Arsenal fan and has previously been described as being obsessed with it. Perhaps it's this lifelong support that's caused the Prime Minister to push ahead with a new piece of legislation aimed at addressing some of the most pressing challenges facing UK football clubs and fans. So in this video, we're going to take a look at Starmer's new bill, the Football Governance Bill. Looking first at what the main problems facing UK football are, how the bill aims to address them, and whether they'll likely work. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, let's start by going through some of the problems that football clubs are currently facing. Now, despite the exorbitant fees paid to both players and managers, football clubs are actually generally facing some pretty big financial issues. In the 2022-23 season, 45% of clubs in the top league in England, the Premier League, operated with a negative cash flow. This is despite generating more revenue than any other league in the world. And things are even worse in the Championship, one division down, where out of the 22 teams, only one had a positive cash flow, Huddersfield Town. And to be fair, it should be noted here that as Huddersfield was recently relegated from the Premier League, they were in receipt of parachute payments, which almost certainly helped push them into the black. Just to demonstrate further the precarious financial position that many clubs find themselves in, 52% of clubs in the top 5 leagues of English football have negative equity, meaning that a club has more liabilities than assets. Again, this is more pronounced in Championship clubs, where a huge 83% of teams are in negative equity. As a result of all of this, many clubs rely on owner funding in order to stay afloat, mainly because traditional banks are reluctant to lend money to football teams due to the risk they pose. In the Premier League, about 37% of borrowing from clubs comes from their owners. Again, in the Championship, this is even more stark, with about 85% of borrowing coming from owners. Now, there are two reasonable questions to ask here. Firstly, why do clubs have to resort to money from their owners in order to stay afloat? And secondly, why is this a bad thing? Well, let's answer those questions in turn. When the Premier League was first introduced back in 1992, teams in the league collectively took in about £205 million a year. By the 2021-2022 season, this had grown to £5.5 billion, an increase of 2,559%. Now, this sounds like a lot, and that's because it is. However, in the same period, wages grew by a shockingly large 3,613%. Ultimately then, revenue just hasn't kept up with wages, and this is borne out when we take a look specifically at wage ratios. Effectively, UEFA advises that clubs in the Premier League don't allow their wage-to-income ratio to exceed 70%. And clubs have ignored this advice and do in fact have wage-to-income ratios in excess of 70%. Now, this is one reason why clubs are having to take more money from their owners, but there is another separate issue. Clubs in the English Football League, the 3 leagues below the Premier League, feel that they're being screwed over when it comes to revenue for broadcast rights of football games. Over the last year, negotiations have taken place between the Premier League and the EFL over how these revenues should be split. As things stand, through broadcast deals, the Premier League pulls in about £3 billion a year, of which 16% is distributed to the lower leagues. Some of this is via parachute payments, some of it's via media rights and sponsorships, and some of it is via solidarity payments. Essentially though, the EFL wants to simplify and expand how these broadcast payments work, in order to close the wealth gap between the Premier League and the Championship. And to be fair to the EFL, the gulf does seem to be pretty massive. In 2019, the team at the bottom of the Premier League, Huddersfield Town, earned £96 million, while the team at the top of the Championship, Norwich, earned about £8 million. And as you'll remember, many of the problems we explained earlier affected the Championship a lot more than the Premier League, precisely because of this broadcast settlement and how the money's divided. This is why so many teams have to rely on money from their owners, especially in the Championship. So now that we understand why the teams have to rely on their owners' money so much, why is that a bad thing? Well, unlike other businesses, football clubs have massive community value. While deindustrialization ripped through the country in the 1980s, to many people and groups, their local team was one of the things that kept their community together. This is still the case today, and the support of a certain team is something of an inheritance from one generation to another. The best example of this is probably from the animator of this very video, who not only has a season ticket with his dad, but quite literally wears his heart on his sleeve. Leaving the survival of such clubs to the daily financial whims of rich owners just doesn't seem right to many, and is one of the main driving forces behind the Football Governance Bill. In order to address this, the government aims to create a new football regulator called the Independent Football Regulator, or IFR, whose job it is to tackle rogue owners and directors, implement a club licensing regime to ensure a more consistent approach in how clubs are run, monitor club finances, and improve fan engagement throughout the football pyramid. Now, the way that the IFR will do this is by providing clubs with a license to operate. In order to receive a license, they'll need to prove that they comply with financial regulation. Similarly, the bill aims to strengthen owners and directors' tests to make sure that any club owner is suitable. As the regulator isn't yet actually established, we don't know exactly what the financial regulation will be, nor how they'll strengthen the owners and directors' tests in order to try and protect clubs. Given the current precarious position of clubs across the Premier League and EFL, it's likely though that financial regulations will be quite strict. Additionally, the IFR will be given the power to intervene in the ongoing financial dispute that we explained earlier between the Premier League and EFL if a new broadcast agreement isn't made. Again, given how seriously this impacts the financial suitability of clubs, it's likely the IFR will move with some urgency in order to ensure that a fair settlement is reached as soon as possible. So this is how the IFR will impact club finances, but it also has a couple of other powers too. The first is to try and provide fans with more input and say over their clubs. As such, the IFR will enforce compliance of fan engagement, with them setting a minimum standard for fan engagement and enforcing that clubs take part in club heritage protections. The second is to prevent clubs from joining competitions where they are not fair, meritocratic, and would threaten the heritage and sustainability of English football. Now, some of you are probably wondering why this oddly specific power is included in the remit of the IFR. Well, look back to 2021 and a new semi-closed league called the European Super League was proposed, in which some of the biggest teams on the continent could compete. This was massively controversial though, as there'll be no way for teams to rise through the football pyramid and get promoted to the league. As such, it was perceived as a cash grab, and the backlash against it was so intense that the idea was essentially parked. Now, in essence, the new bill will ensure that no such league will get off the ground, in the UK at least. All in all though, we'll just have to wait and see whether the bill is successful overall, if and when it makes it onto the statute book. This isn't the only major issue Labour have inherited though. For instance, the debate over migrant boats continues, with 35 outlets reporting on Starmer's recent comments alone. Interestingly, 22% of this reporting is coming from the left, and a matching 22% is coming from the right. If you compare the headlines though, you'll start to notice some interesting framing emerge. On the left, you have Politico accusing Starmer's policy of being the same as the Tories, while on the right, you have some more bombastic language about treating smugglers as terrorists or smashing vile gangs. They're reporting on the same thing, but from their tone and framing, you really wouldn't think they are. Now, all of this analysis is possible thanks to our sponsor, Ground News, a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. They pull in stories from all over the world and organize them by story, with each story coming with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. One of my favorite features is their blind spot feed, which shows you stories underreported by one side of the political spectrum or the other. For example, if you lean left, you might have missed this story about Starmer facing pressure to remove MP Dawn Butler over a white supremacy tweet. Ground News is such an incredibly useful platform that captures information you just can't get anywhere else. It's especially useful when you're looking at news stories from around the world, as I'm sure our very global audience often does. If you're not familiar with the media market, it's hard to know who you should trust. So Ground's guidance can prove invaluable whether you're a European trying to unpack the US election or an American trying to understand the Bulgarian one. Okay, the latter does sound less likely. Best of all, Ground are currently offering our viewers a 50% discount on their Vantage plan, which includes unlimited access to their election pages, blind spot feed, and many other features that empower you as a news consumer. This is their biggest discount yet, so go to ground.news/TLDR, scan the QR code on screen, or use the link in the video's description to subscribe today.